Welcome to tonight's journey into the unknown. Hospitals are places where life begins and where it often ends. In the quiet hours of the night, the walls remember, the rooms breathe, and sometimes not every patient has left. Tonight, I will share with you 3 true scary hospital stories. So find a quiet place, dim the lights, and let your mind drift into the shadows of the ward. This is True Scary Hospital Stories. Our first story takes us deep into a quiet hospital wing, a place where nurses whispered about strange footsteps in the halls, footsteps that belonged to no one living. This is the story of the night shift in Ward C. Story 1. True Scary Hospital Stories. The night shift in Ward C. Hospitals, for most people, are places of healing. Bright corridors filled with the smell of disinfectant, the steady hum of machines, and the quiet shuffle of nurses going about their work. But for those who have spent the long hours of night inside their walls, hospitals can take on a very different character. When the sun sets and the busy sounds of visiting hours fade away, hospitals often reveal a side of themselves that is not just quiet, but unsettling. This is one of those true scary hospital stories. And it comes from a nurse named Claire, who worked the night shift for nearly a decade in a large, aging hospital on the East Coast of the United States. Claire often said that night shifts brought out the strangest experiences. Patients who seemed to see things that weren't there, equipment that malfunctioned for no reason, and shadows that never quite belonged to anyone. But there was one particular night, deep in the winter of 2009, that would forever mark her memory. It happened in Ward C, a wing of the hospital that dated back to the 1950s. Unlike the newer, brighter wings, Ward C still had the original tiled floors, the creaking metal-framed beds, and narrow hallways lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. It was the ward where long-term patients were kept, many of them elderly, and most of them in fragile health. Claire was used to walking those halls. She knew the way the shadows pooled in the corners, the way the old heating system clicked and hissed, and the faint smell of antiseptic that seemed permanently absorbed into the walls. But that night, something was different, something she could never fully explain. The first sign the shift began quietly enough. Around 11 p.m., Claire made her rounds. Most of the patients were already asleep, their faces pale against white pillows, their breathing steady but fragile. Machines beeped in soft rhythms, for bags dripped slowly, and the ward seemed calm. But as she passed room 6, she felt a sudden chill. The temperature dropped, just for a moment, sharp enough that she pulled her sweater tighter around her. She glanced at the thermostat, but it read a steady 72 degrees. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination, or maybe the draft from an old vent. Still, she made a note of it. Inside room 6 was an elderly man named Mr. Harrison. He had been in and out of the hospital for years, a frail but kind soul who often told Claire stories about his youth. That night, though, when she peeked in, she saw that he was awake. His eyes were wide open, staring at the corner of the room. "Mr. Harrison," Claire whispered gently, "can't sleep?" He didn't respond at first. His gaze stayed fixed on the far corner, where the shadows were thickest. After a long pause, he whispered back, "Do you see her?" Claire frowned. "See who?" "The woman," he said. His voice cracked, fragile with fear. "She's standing right there." Claire turned to look. The corner was empty. Just the shadow of an 4-pole stretched across the wall. "There's no one there, Mr. Harrison," she reassured him softly. "Maybe you're just dreaming." But Mr. Harrison shook his head slowly. No, she's here. She's been here all night. Watching. The second sign Claire tried to comfort him, but as she left the room, unease crawled up her spine. Patients sometimes hallucinated, especially with age or medication, but something about the way he said it stayed with her. Half an hour later, as she passed the nurse's station, she heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in the hall. That wasn't unusual. Other staff often made rounds, but when she looked down the hallway it was empty. The sound continued for a few seconds, steady and unnerving, before fading into silence. She waited, expecting someone to appear around the corner. But no one came. When she finally moved forward, she noticed something strange. The motion sensor lights in the far corridor had flicked on, as if someone had just walked through. But the hallway remained empty. Claire tried to push down the growing chill in her chest. Hospitals were full of odd noises, plumbing, vents, equipment, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. The third sign, it was around 2 a.m. when things escalated. Claire was updating charts at the nurse's station when she heard a call bell go off. The soft, chiming tone came from room 6, Mr. Harrison's room. She rose quickly, walked down the hall, and entered. But what she saw made her stop cold. The call bell button was still in Mr. Harrison's hand. He had pressed it, clearly in distress. His breathing was shallow, his eyes wide, and tears streamed down his cheeks. "She was right here," he whispered urgently. "She stood over me, right by my bed. She leaned down, close to my face. I could feel her breathing." Claire's heart thudded heavily in her chest. She scanned the room again. Empty. Just the steady beep of the heart monitor and the soft drip of the 4. "Mr. Harrison, you're safe," she whispered. "I'm here now. No one else is here." But he shook his head furiously. "She's not gone. She never leaves." The whispering as the night stretched on, the ward grew quieter, heavier. Around 3:15 a.m., Claire was refilling supplies in the storage closet when she heard it, soft whispering. At first, she thought it was another nurse. But when she stepped into the hall, it was empty. The whispering continued, faint and low, like two people speaking in hushed tones just beyond her hearing. She followed the sound down the corridor, past room 4, then room 5, until it stopped right outside room 6. Her hand froze on the doorknob. She opened the door slowly. Inside, Mr. Harrison was sitting upright in bed, staring once again at that same dark corner. "She's talking to me," he said hoarsely. "She wants me to come with her." Claire's stomach knotted. "Mr. Harrison, don't listen. There's no one here." But the old man just shook his head. "You don't understand. She's been waiting for me. For a long time." The shadow the rest of the shift passed in a blur of unease. Claire stayed close to room 6, checking on Mr. Harrison every half hour. Each time he seemed weaker, paler, as if the life was draining from him. And then around 4:45 a.m., it happened. As Claire walked past his room, she glanced through the open doorway. For the briefest second, she saw something she would never forget. A figure stood in the corner. A tall, thin woman dressed in what looked like an old hospital gown. Her face was pale, her hair long and dark, hanging loose over her shoulders. And her eyes were fixed directly on Mr. Harrison. Claire froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't fade. It just stood there, watching. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The corner was empty once again. Claire's hands trembled. She stepped inside quickly, her heart racing. Mr. Harrison was lying back, eyes closed, breathing shallow. "Mr. Harrison," she whispered, moving to his side. He opened his eyes one last time. "She's here," he murmured weakly. "She says it's time." And with that his chest fell still. The monitor gave one long, steady tone. Aftermath. The doctors came quickly. They tried to resuscitate him, but it was no use. Mr. Harrison had passed away. For most of the staff, it was just another death in a place that saw them often. But for Claire, it was different. She knew what she had seen, and she knew what he had seen. After that night, Claire never looked at Ward C the same way again. Nurses whispered about room 6, about strange cold spots, about patients who claimed to see a woman in white. Some believed it was the spirit of a former patient, someone who had died long ago in that very room. Others thought it was simply the stress of long hours, the tricks of a tired mind. But Claire knew better. She had seen the figure with her own eyes. She had felt the chill, heard the whispers. And she would never forget the look of relief on Mr. Harrison's face as he slipped away, as if finally, after all those years, he had joined the woman who had been waiting for him. Even years later, when she moved to another hospital, Claire never spoke of it openly. But in quiet moments she would think of Ward C. She would think of the long, silent halls, the cold corners, the footsteps in the dark. And she would remember that hospitals are not just places of healing. They're also places of endings. And sometimes, those endings come with shadows that never truly leave. If that left you unsettled, then listen closely to what comes next. The halls of hospitals hide more than just whispers. Our second story comes from a security guard, a man who thought he was alone during his rounds until he discovered he wasn't. This is the story of the Forgotten Hospital Wing. Story 2. True scary hospital stories. The Forgotten Wing hospitals are built to save lives. To heal, to comfort, to give people a chance to walk back out into the world. But anyone who has spent long nights inside one knows there is another side to these places. When the lights dim and the halls grow quiet, hospitals begin to reveal their secrets. This is the second of our true scary hospital stories, and it comes from a man named Daniel, who worked as a hospital security guard in the early 1990s. For most guards, the night shift was quiet. A few unruly visitors, the occasional patient who tried to slip out for a cigarette, a malfunctioning door alarm. But Daniel was assigned to one of the oldest hospitals in his state. Parts of it were modern, but tucked behind newer wings was a section that had been shut down for decades. It was called the East Wing. No patients had been housed there since the early 1970s. The floors were cracked, the paint peeled from the walls, and old gurneys stood abandoned in dusty corners. Officially, the wing was locked and unused. But for years, staff whispered about strange noises there at night. Voices, footsteps, and sometimes the sound of crying. The assignment. Daniel didn't believe in ghost stories. He was practical, calm, and steady, the kind of man you wanted watching the halls in the early hours of the morning. One night, just past 2 a.m., his supervisor asked him to check on a motion alarm. "It's in the East Wing," the supervisor said reluctantly. "Probably just a rat. But policy says we have to investigate." Daniel grabbed his flashlight, clipped his radio to his belt, and started down the long hallway that led to the abandoned section. He had walked this way many times before, but only to the locked double doors that marked the start of the East Wing. Beyond those doors he had never gone. Entering the Forgotten Wing, the double doors groaned as he pushed them open. His flashlight beam cut through dust and darkness, landing on a corridor lined with peeling green paint. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and old antiseptic. He stepped inside, boots echoing on the cracked tiles. The silence pressed around him, thick and suffocating. The motion detector had tripped on the third floor, so he made his way toward the stairwell. Each step creaked under his weight, the sound amplified in the emptiness. By the time he reached the third floor, the air felt colder. His breath misted faintly in the beam of his flashlight. He swept the light down the hallway. Empty patient rooms stretched into the dark, doors half open, revealing broken beds and rusted equipment. The place looked frozen in time, as if everyone had simply walked out one day and never returned. The first sound Daniel was halfway down the corridor when he heard it. A soft, metallic squeak. It came from one of the rooms to his left. He stopped, heart thudding slowly. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a gurney's wheels turning. He stepped into the room, flashlight beam cutting through shadows. A rusted gurney sat against the far wall, its mattress torn open, stuffing spilling out. For a moment, the room was silent. And then the gurney moved. Just a few inches. Just enough for the metal to squeak. Daniel froze. He told himself it was the building settling, maybe the floor uneven. But as he watched, the gurney shifted again. Slowly, steadily, it rolled forward, stopping in the middle of the room. The second sound Daniel backed out, his throat dry. He kept walking down the corridor, telling himself to finish the check and get out. But then came the second sound. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps, echoing from the far end of the hall. He raised his flashlight, the beam trembling slightly in his hand. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with doors, empty and silent. But the footsteps continued. Slow. Even. Approaching. Hello, he called, his voice steady though his pulse raced. Security. Who's there? The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The crying, he was almost at the end of the hall when he heard something else. Crying. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It sounded like a child. The soft, broken sobs drifted from one of the rooms on the right. Daniel hesitated. He had no children of his own, but the sound tugged at something deep inside him. Carefully, he stepped into the room. It was small, with peeling wallpaper patterned in faded stars. An old hospital crib sat against the wall, its metal frame rusting, its mattress bare. The crying grew louder. But the crib was empty. He swept his flashlight across the room. Shadows clung to the corners. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him. And then it stopped. The woman in white by now, Daniel's calm exterior was cracking. He wanted to finish the check and leave the wing behind. He turned back toward the stairwell, quickening his pace. But halfway down the hall, he stopped. A figure stood at the far end of the corridor. A woman. She was tall, thin, dressed in a white hospital gown that hung loosely from her shoulders. Her long dark hair fell forward, obscuring her face. She didn't move. She just stood there, motionless, as if waiting. Daniel's breath caught. His flashlight trembled in his hand. "Ma'am," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You're not supposed to be here. Are you lost?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she began to walk. Slowly, silently, toward him. The approach, every instinct told him to run. But his training kept him rooted. He raised his flashlight, shining it directly on her. For a moment, he thought the beam might reveal her face. But it didn't. Her features were blurred, indistinct, like smoke behind glass. She came closer. Her bare feet made no sound on the cracked tiles. When she was only 10 feet away, Daniel finally stepped back. His radio crackled softly on his belt, but no voice came through. The woman lifted her head slightly, and then, in a voice so faint he barely heard it, she whispered, "Get out." The escape, that was all it took. Daniel turned and ran. His boots pounded the hallway, the beam of his flashlight jerking wildly. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. He reached the stairwell, threw open the door, and raced down the steps 2 at a time. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, though he couldn't tell if they were real or just in his mind. By the time he burst back through the double doors into the main hospital, he was gasping for breath. Sweat dripped down his face, his hands shook, and his heart thundered in his chest. The corridor outside the East Wing was quiet. Normal. Nurses moved calmly between rooms. Machines beeped steadily. The world seemed unchanged. But Daniel knew better. Aftermath, he filed his report, writing only that he had found nothing unusual. But he never went back into the East Wing again. Other guards told their own stories, doors slamming on their own, shadows moving across walls, the faint echo of voices in the night. But no one spoke openly of the woman in white. Some said she had been a patient long ago, a mother who lost her child in that very wing. Others whispered that she was a nurse who had taken her own life after a tragedy. No one knew for certain. What Daniel knew was this: the East Wing was not empty. It was never truly empty. Even now, decades later, he remembers her words. That soft, chilling whisper that seemed to cling to the air long after he had fled. Get out! And now, for our final story of the night. Sometimes it's not the halls or the rooms, but the very elevators that carry us between them, that hold something sinister. This last story follows a therapist whose late-night ride to the basement revealed a presence that should never have been there. This is the story of the haunted elevator. Story 3. True scary hospital stories. The elevator that shouldn't stop hospitals are full of rituals. Rounds at certain hours, medicines given at precise times, lights dimmed late in the evening, and the slow, steady rhythm of the night shift. These routines bring comfort in a place that is often filled with pain, grief, and uncertainty. But sometimes even the most ordinary parts of a hospital can become the most frightening. This is the third of our true scary hospital stories, and it comes from a respiratory therapist named Elena, who worked in a large hospital in the Midwest during the early 2000s. Elena had always loved working nights. The world seemed quieter then, calmer, the distractions of the day melting away into stillness. But there was one part of her routine that she never grew comfortable with: taking the service elevator in the oldest part of the hospital. It wasn't just her. Many staff avoided that elevator whenever possible. It was slow, the lights inside flickered, and sometimes it stopped at floors no one had called it to. Most people chalked it up to old wiring. But Elena would come to know it was much more than that. The start of the shift, it was a winter night in 2004. Snow drifted softly outside, blanketing the city in white. Inside the hospital, the night shift had just begun. Elena was making her rounds, checking on patients with breathing difficulties. She carried her equipment in a rolling bag, moving from floor to floor. Normally, she used the main elevators, but on this night, they were being repaired. That meant she had no choice but to take the service elevator. She sighed when she saw it, its metal doors dull with age, a faint buzzing sound coming from behind them. Just an elevator, she whispered to herself. Nothing more. She pressed the button. The doors opened with a groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. She stepped inside, the smell of oil and rust filling her nose. She pressed the button for the 6th floor, where her next patient waited. The elevator shuddered, then began its slow climb. The first stop halfway up, the elevator jolted to a stop. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Elena frowned. She hadn't pressed this floor. The panel showed she was on the 3rd. The doors slid open with a reluctant screech. The hallway beyond was dark. No lights, no movement. Just shadows stretching into silence. The 3rd floor of the old wing had been closed for years. Renovations had been planned, but funding never came. No patients were housed there anymore. Elena hesitated, her stomach tightening. She reached to press the close button. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps approaching the elevator. The passenger, her pulse quickened. Maybe it was another staff member, she thought. Maybe security or maintenance. But as the footsteps drew closer, she saw a shape emerge from the shadows. A man, tall, thin, wearing a hospital gown. His skin was pale, almost gray. His bare feet dragged against the floor as he walked. Elena froze, her hand hovering over the button. The man stopped just outside the elevator. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening. And then, without a word, he stepped inside. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The air grew cold, chilling her to the bone. The man didn't look at her. He just stood there, facing the corner, silent and still. The doors slid shut. The elevator began to move again. The ride, Elena's heart pounded. She tried to speak, her voice trembling. Are you okay? Do you need help? The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed. She glanced at the panel. The elevator was moving past the 6th floor now. She hadn't pressed anything. The lights flickered again. The floor numbers ticked upward. 7, 8, 9. The hospital only had 8 floors. Her breath quickened. The elevator shuddered to a stop. The doors opened. The 9th floor beyond the doors was a hallway Elena had never seen before. The walls were gray, cracked, lined with peeling paint. The floor was littered with old equipment, broken stretchers, and rusted wheelchairs. The air smelled of mold and something sharper, something metallic. Blood. Elena's knees weakened. She knew this floor didn't exist. She knew it wasn't possible. But the man in the gown stepped forward. He walked slowly into the hallway, never looking back. Elena's instincts screamed at her to shut the doors, to leave. But she couldn't move. Her body felt frozen, her eyes locked on the figure. As he reached the far end of the hall, he stopped. Slowly, he turned his head. For the first time, she saw his face. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring straight into her. His mouth opened slowly, impossibly wide. And then, in a voice like a whisper from the grave, he spoke. "Ride's not over." The descent, the lights inside the elevator died. Darkness swallowed her. The doors slammed shut, and the elevator dropped. Elena screamed, clutching the rail as the car plummeted. The sound of rushing air roared in her ears. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The lights flickered back on. The panel read, "Ground floor." The doors opened to the bright, bustling lobby. Nurses walked past, a janitor pushed a mop, and the world seemed normal again. Elena stumbled out, her legs trembling. She turned back to look. The elevator stood empty. Silent, as if nothing had happened. Aftermath, Elena never spoke of it to her colleagues. Who would believe her? But she never set foot in that service elevator again. She took the stairs if she had to, no matter how many flights. Over the years, she heard whispers from others. Stories of that elevator stopping at the wrong floors. Of voices heard inside. Of passengers who vanished before the doors opened. Some said the hospital had once had a ninth floor, long ago, before a fire destroyed it. Dozens had died in the blaze, patients, nurses, doctors. Officially, the floor was sealed, erased from the hospital's plans. But maybe it wasn't erased completely. Maybe on certain nights the elevator still remembered. And maybe it still carried passengers who were never meant to leave. The final ride, even now, years later, Elena dreams of that ride. She dreams of the man in the gown. The way he never looked at her, until he did. The way his empty eyes locked on hers. She dreams of that hallway that shouldn't exist. The peeling paint. The smell of blood. The silence broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat. And always she dreams of his words. Ride's not over. When she wakes, her skin is cold, her heart racing. And though she no longer works at that hospital, she avoids elevators whenever she can. Because she knows. Some rides never end. You've just heard 3 true scary hospital stories. Stories that remind us that hospitals are not just places of medicine, but also places of memory, and sometimes of things that refuse to leave. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, don't forget to subscribe, and join me again for more true scary stories for sleep. Until then, keep your lights low and your mind open. Good night.